So, today we're going to dive into a really fascinating and, yeah, a pretty challenging book, Jacques Derrida, Specters of Marx. It was written at this wild moment when everyone thought history was basically over. But it asks this question that feels more important now than ever. What happens when the past just refuses to stay dead? To really get this book, you gotta picture the scene. It's the early 1990s, the Berlin Wall, it's rubble, the Soviet Union has collapsed, and in the West, there was this, well, Derrida's editors called it an orgy of self-congratulations. The feeling in the air was that the big, epic battle of ideas was finally done, and liberal democracy and capitalism had won. Game over. But right in the middle of this massive victory lap, the philosopher Jacques Derrida steps in and asks this really strange, kind of unsettling question. He looks at this brand new world order, supposedly free of its old enemies, and he just wonders, what about the ghosts? What if just saying something is dead doesn't actually make it go away for good? So, how are we gonna unpack all this? Well, we've got a roadmap. First, we'll look at that whole end of history idea that Derrida was arguing against. Then, we'll get to know the man himself, the famous philosopher of deconstruction. After that, we'll explore this incredible analogy he uses from Shakespeare's Hamlet, see how he diagnosed the world's problems, and finally, really get a handle on what he meant by a justice for the future. All right, let's set the stage properly. Imagine it's 1993, and the whole world, or at least the Western world, is buzzing with this feeling of triumph. And this idea, which Francis Fukuyama really famously put into words, was everywhere. The basic theory was that humanity had finally figured it out. We'd reached our final form, liberal democracy plus a free market economy. There were no other serious options on the table. History, as this grand clash of ideas, was finished. It was a neat, tidy story, and boy was it popular. And the person who decided to mess up that neat, tidy story? That was Jacques Derrida. Now look, Derrida had a reputation. Even his own New York Times obituary called him an abstruse theorist. And yeah, his work can be dense. But his whole project was always about questioning the things we just assumed to be true, the assumptions hiding right there in plain sight. He was born in French Algeria, then moved to Paris, and pretty quickly became a giant in French philosophy. So by the time he gives the lectures in 1993 that turn into this book, he's one of the most influential and, yeah, one of the most controversial thinkers on the planet. He was an outsider who made it to the very center of Western thought, and that gave him this completely unique perspective to critique it all. And this brings us to his most famous method, deconstruction. It's not about destroying things, not at all. Think of it like being a really careful mechanic for ideas. You take an argument apart, piece by piece, not to break it, but to see how it really works. You know, what parts are essential, what's been kind of patched over, and most importantly, what had to be left out entirely just to make the whole thing seem like it runs smoothly. Derrida believed our biggest ideas always rely on these hidden secrets. So how does Derrida deconstruct this whole end of history idea? He doesn't pull out economic charts. Nope. He turns to Shakespeare. He zooms in on this one legendary line from Hamlet. After Hamlet sees the ghost of his murdered father, he feels like the world itself is just broken. It's dislocated. It's not right. For Derrida, this isn't just some fancy literary phrase. He thinks it's a deep philosophical diagnosis of a specific moment in time. And this is just a brilliant way to show his core argument. On one side, you've got Hamlet's Denmark. The old king is officially dead and buried, there's a new guy on the throne, but the ghost is still there, proving that something is rotten. On the other side, you have the world after the Cold War. Communism is officially dead, but Derrida says it's still haunting the place. I mean, the very first line of the Communist Manifesto was, "A specter is haunting Europe." Derrida's basically saying, well, guess what? It still is. Okay, so here's the crucial point. This ghost of Marx isn't just about remembering the Soviet Union. No, it's the spirit of a promise of freedom, of equality, of justice for people who've been oppressed. By declaring Marx dead and gone, the triumphant new world was also trying to bury all those unfinished demands for justice right along with him. But a ghost, well, a ghost doesn't stay buried. So Derrida takes this poetic idea of a time being out of joint, and he applies it directly to the very real, very messy problems of the 1990s. He's giving the new era a checkup. And he wasn't just speaking in riddles. He listed what he called the 10 plagues of this new global order. And just listen to some of these. Crippling foreign debt, ruthless economic wars between countries, a totally out-of-control arms trade, kicking out refugees and the homeless, and the fact that the free market couldn't even sort out its own problems. I mean, does any of that sound at all familiar? So, for Derrida, the verdict was clear. The world wasn't fixed. It was, and I'm using his words here, worn and disadjusted. The victory party was way too early because it was totally ignoring the millions of people for whom history had definitely not ended, people for whom deep injustice was just Tuesday. The ghost was whispering that this story was far from over.
And this gets us to the real heart of the book. It's not just a complaint. It's a powerful call to action. What do we actually owe these ghosts?
Now, to understand his answer, you have to get this one key distinction he makes. On one hand, you've got the law. That's the system of rules, courts, rights. It's concrete. You can calculate it. And we need it. But for Derrida, justice is something totally different. It's this infinite, unconditional demand. It's that feeling of responsibility you have to another person, a responsibility that no law or system could ever fully satisfy. And this part is absolutely crucial. Derrida is not saying, let's bring back Soviet-style communism. He says himself his work is neither Marxist nor non-Marxist. The point isn't to bring back some dead political system. The point, as he puts it, is to learn to live with our ghosts, to actually listen to what they're saying about a justice that we haven't achieved yet, and to accept that it's our job to carry that demand forward. He calls this really hopeful but also really challenging idea a democracy to come. It's not some perfect utopia we're going to reach one day. It's the constant, never-ending promise of a more just world. And it's that promise that keeps democracy alive and open and always striving for something better, precisely because it's haunted by the specters of all the injustices it still needs to fix. And so Derrida leaves us with a question that's just as powerful today as it was back in 1993. If we really stop and listen, what ghosts are haunting our world right now? The ghosts of histories we haven't dealt with, of promises we've forgotten, of injustices happening as we speak? And maybe the most important question of all, what are they asking of us? That's the real challenge of Specters of Marx, and it's a question we're all left to answer for ourselves.